right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to LD at School's fifth and final webinar for the 2022-2023 school year, or our webinar season, as I've been calling it in my head. My name is Susanna Miller, and I'll be handling the technical side of things for this afternoon. If anyone is experiencing any technical issues at this time, you can contact our team using the Q&A box or the chat function, and we will do our best to assist you. After the webinar, we'll be sending out presentation slides and a link to a survey that provides us with feedback on the webinar. We are also recording this, so the recording will be available in approximately 3 weeks after we've closed captioned and transcribed it for accessibility. And if you've registered for this webinar, you will be the first to receive an email when that recording is available. If you would like to have a copy of the slides right now for this presentation, you can go to our Padlet. You can see the address at the top of the screen, but I won't make you rewrite that. I will drop that address in the chat box at the moment I stop speaking here. Again, if you've got any technical problems today or any questions you have for us, please contact us using the chat or the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. So that takes care of most of the housekeeping for today. So I would like to welcome you and let you know that the LD at School team is very pleased to welcome our guest speakers, Karyn Bruneel and Bobbie Chatha, whose presentation this afternoon is entitled Setting the Direction for the Right to Read. The Ministry of Education has provided funding for the production of this webinar. Please note that the views expressed in this webinar are the views of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect those of the Ministry of Education nor the Learning Disabilities Association of Ontario. We will also be tweeting throughout the webinar, so if you'd like to participate in the conversation, you can send us a tweet by using our handle, which is at the bottom of the screen there, @LDAtSchool, or by using the hashtag #LDWebinar. So please join me in welcoming our presenters today. Bobbie Chatha is currently a system principal with the Waterloo Region District School Board. She identifies as South Asian and her pronouns are she, her. Bobbie has worked in education for the past 26 years with 3 different school boards. Bobbie began her career at Regent Park Public School with the Toronto District School Board and moved to the Peel District School Board before settling down with her family in Kitchener-Waterloo in 2003. Bobbie has worked as a principal in both elementary and secondary schools, including remote learning. She has a passion for program and instruction and has taught additional qualification courses in reading and worked as a literacy and math coach to support educators and administrators. In her free time, Bobbie enjoys riding motorcycles, shopping, yoga, and eating out, and when possible, hikes with her 2 adult sons and hubby. Karyn Bruneel is currently the superintendent for education with Bruce Grey Catholic District School Board. She's worked for the past 28 years with various Catholic district school boards and has been seconded to the Ministry of Education as the principal of Amethyst Demonstration School and as the executive director of the Provincial and Demonstration Schools branch. She has a background in French immersion as both a teacher and principal and has special interest in reading, writing, and math instruction and special education. Karyn teaches courses online and provides workshops and training on these topics for educators, parents, and education stakeholders. So with that, I will hand the floor over to Karyn, Bobbie, and our moderator for today, Martin Smith, the educational consultant here at LD at School. The floor is now yours.
Perfect. Thank you very much. It's really my pleasure to be here. I get to moderate this session with Bobbie and Karyn, and I'm really excited because I've known Karyn for quite some time and worked with her, and Bobbie is a new friend to me, so I'm really excited to have Bobbie here too. And I'm going to do my best, Bobbie, not to ask about the motorcycles, because that is really, although we have got great questions today, I think that's the burning question in my mind, but we'll save that for another time. Thanks to Susanna for taking care of the introductions, and I just wanted to let you know that we will have some time for questions at the end of the webinar, but you're also welcome to put them into the chat or the Q&A as we go forward. And if we see them, we might try to grab them on the fly. Otherwise, we'll get them at the end. Just before we get started, I wanted to talk just a little bit about the right to read and the human rights, the Ontario Human Rights Commission. Just a little bit of a reminder for us to set the stage as we go. And it's a bit shocking. You think that Human Rights Commission announced the inquiry almost 4 years ago. The right to read has been going on for that long, where they worked with boards throughout Ontario to gather some information. And it was, as we know, released on February 28th, 2022. And some interesting things that came through that release was that although it started with a focus on students with learning disabilities, the report really finished off by saying that everything in the report applies to all students and not just those with learning disabilities. There are 157 recommendations, and the bottom line really was a statement saying that Ontario is currently not fulfilling its obligations to meet the students' right to read. And that's really the impetus for today, what we wanted to talk about, and a little bit about how the ministry responded so far. They put a commitment of $25 million towards evidence-based resources and programs and professional learning. And that is, currently rolling out. I know that there was, I think in April, a memo that went out talking a little more about that. And I know that a lot of people would be familiar with that. The ministry also has fulfilled some of its commitments. One was the science-based guide that goes along with the curriculum on effective early reading instruction. We know that a lot of us are waiting for the release of the revised language curriculum. I believe it's supposed to be coming sometime in 2023, and some other areas, as well as the development of French language reading interventions, which I know that the French language boards are very excited about. Well, boards have also been responding in various ways, and I know from speaking with people across the province, with the contacts that I have through LD at School, through that project, that the response across the province is very varied. And we know that some boards have been sort of starting slowly, testing the waters, and doing some other work to make sure that they're on the right course. And we know that there's other boards that have been prepping for a number of years, even before the report was released, and knowing that the report was underway. And some of these boards have jumped in with 2 feet. And I think that really kind of describes the 2 folks that we have with us here today. Bobbie and Karyn have been involved in the right to read recommendations and working with evidence-based instruction for quite some time in their boards. And we're really excited to hear what they have to say. We worked together to create some questions, and we're going to take turns answering the questions. And like I said, there'll be time for any more questions as we go on. So I guess the first question, I'm going to start with Karyn. And we already talked about the right to read inquiry, Karyn, and saying that, that there was really this idea that we're failing students with reading disabilities and, struggling readers because we haven't really been using evidence-based approaches to read. So I wonder if you could talk, Karyn, a little bit about the impetus for change in your district school board.
Sure. We started back in about 2018 when the curriculum SO and I were both hired together to the board. So like you said, that was a little bit before the right to read was actually happening, but some of the consultations had already started and we knew it was coming. There had also been an LD pilot that kind of led us to that conclusion. I had read 2 books that really kind of changed my thinking on reading because I was big into balanced literacy prior. So I read The Knowledge Gap by Natalie Wexler and Proust and the Squid, which really kind of started my evolution of thinking about reading. And then, like you said, I had the opportunity to be able to go to Amethyst Demonstration School, which was really a focus on evidence-based reading strategies there, where I got to learn more about that. And then coming from there back into the board, I knew that the data that we were looking at was not showing that 95% of our students were reading fluently and that we could be doing something potentially much different. So what we decided is that we wanted to move carefully. We knew that there were reading wars that were going on in places and we didn't want to alert people necessarily on that kind of a level. So we decided really just to get an understanding across the board about the sequence of instruction. So we started with the University of Oregon's work, where they have the 5 big ideas in early literacy, starting off with phonological and phonemic awareness and moving through phonics and then to fluency and vocabulary all the way through to be able to get to comprehension, just as kind of like a sequence of instruction. So we did some PD on what high quality instruction reading would look like. We also knew that math was an issue, so we started building out a tiered system because we had been using the reading recovery model, which meant that we didn't have a tiered system in place. So reading and writing was kind of our beginning part of where we were starting off at the beginning, and then kind of dabbling a little bit in math and the emotional and behavioral interventions.
Thanks, Karyn. Bobbie, do you want to take over a bit?
Yeah, thank you for having us, and thanks for joining us, everyone. So this work began in the summer of 2021 at the Waterloo Region District School Board, where we had a lot of our central leads, our consultants and staff had come together to unpack the work of reviewing how students learn to read. And we just dove into the learning about the essential and the foundational skills to reading. And then from there, it was really the release, February 28th of 2020, the release of the Right to Read recommendations that really drove us to move forward into those next steps. But next slide, please. Yeah, this is also another piece where we were really keen on knowing that, 95% of our students can actually, we could teach 95% of our students to read, and that, most reading failure is unnecessary. And so we really looked at, what is that 30% of students that we are not supporting? And they were the students who are our MLL learners, our multi-language learners, our racialized and Indigenous students, our students with language deficits, our students with learning disabilities, and our students who could not access any sort of private instruction or assessment. And so it was really important for us to bring on that equity lens and to really think about, reading work is equity work.
Thank you, Bobbie. The next question really talks, I think, a little bit about, the evidence-based instruction. Again, we saw in the report, and I just pulled this recommendation number 30 out, even though it's in I think 27 to 30 really covers them off. But the recommendation that references to the 3 queuing system or queuing systems, guessing strategies, balanced literacy are removed from the curriculum. And I'm going to go back to Karyn, and I just asked the question, how did you begin to change from the 3 queuing system to moving to an evidence-based instructional model?
Okay, so I know I kind of started off talking a little bit about the 5 big ideas in reading instruction, where we were helping people really understand that scope and sequence for reading instruction. So that was an important part. But I think what we decided to do is we decided to build it out from a tier 2 and 3 perspective. So we ended the reading recovery model that we had. It was expensive and it wasn't giving us the results that we needed. And so we moved then into evidence-based programs for the tier 2 and 3 level, so that we almost have then a model of what reading intervention looks like in the classroom, because it was already built out for tiers 2 and 3. So there was that. For the classroom, we also purchased the Heggerty thing and really kind of went with a big focus on phonological and phonemic awareness in kindergarten. And then for our parent volunteers, we got the book, How to Teach Your Child to Read in 100 Easy Lessons, so that as our parent volunteers were helping, everybody was kind of all on the same page. And then in addition to that, we picked out some of our assessment tools that we were going to be using for outcomes assessment, so that we bought the Woodcock Johnson for that. And then we implemented Lexia across our grade 2s, so that teachers could start looking at some of that data and see that scope and sequence. And then we also had resource licenses for kids beyond grade 2 or in different grades who also needed that kind of support. And we introduced the Scarborough's reading rope kind of all together, so that people could kind of see all of the big pieces as we then started digging in later on the smaller pieces.
Thanks, Karyn. And maybe it's a good time to mention that at the end of the webinar, we've actually kind of collected the resources that most of the resources that are being referred to today. We didn't get the 100 lessons, the Reading 100 Lessons, which is a great book. We should get that in there too. So if you don't get a chance to get them all down, most of them are in a slide at the end. Bobbie, can you talk a little bit about moving from 3 queuing to evidence-based programs?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll reiterate some of the things that Karyn had said as well. In the WRDSB, we were moving from the queuing systems to what we have up here is the model of Scarborough's rope. And so we really wanted to show that visual of where we were coming from and where we're moving to. And if you go to the next slide, it's the reason why, right? The reason why we decided to do this is because of what we said in terms of the Right to Read report, but also how the ministry had responded to this and indicating that they would be revising the elementary language curriculum by removing those 3 queuing systems. And you can see that too in the effective early reading instruction, the movement of moving away from 3 queuing systems into something like Scarborough's rope, which we have as a board adopted. And how we did that, if you move to the next slide, this is a bit of a structural piece. How we did that is, as a system, we developed a structured literacy steering committee. And then from there, we had a structured literacy subcommittee. And in the steering committee, we have our associate director who chairs that committee, our superintendents, some system administrators, managers, research, and school instructional leaders, such as principals. And then within the subcommittees that comprise of members from different departments within our central system, both in elementary and the secondary panel, so that we would have representation and a lens from all different departments within our system. And so these committees below meet on a more regular basis, the subcommittees, and the Structured Literacy Steering Committee meets every 8 weeks to ensure that the messaging is across the system from our senior team all the way down to our school administrators and teachers.
So Bobbie, would it be correct to say that it's the steering committee? Are they kind of setting out the direction? Like who's determining what's being read and what's being analyzed, or you know what I mean, for the subcommittees, that everyone stays on the same page?
So there are members from the steering committee in each one of the subcommittees. And so the work is done within the subcommittees and then brought back to the steering committee. And that is where a large number of the decisions are made based on that field intelligence that comes back up to the steering committee, and where we look at, you know, what are the specific next steps based on the needs and what we see within our schools.
Karyn, do you have anything to add here? Because you and I have had many conversations about, you know, the need to be so precise here, that, like, you know, there's so much information out there that kind of can take you down some pretty long winding roads, right? Like, how do you keep that on track?
Well, I think one of the things that has been kind of a change for me is I used to be, when somebody said that research says this, I was like, great, let's do it. And what I've really learned through all of this is the different types of research. And so I think that one of the things that we're doing to keep us on track is making sure that whatever it is that we're doing has some kind of a basis in evidence base, and then actually taking a look at what that evidence base is, because evidence base isn't necessarily just research. Like, you want something that's actually a randomized controlled trial that has been, you know, done in multiple locations with multiple populations and shows the same effects. And I think that that's kind of been really helpful for us to making sure that whatever it is that we're doing, we're always kind of doing that check back.
Great, thank you.
So I can add something here, Martin, with this.
Sure.
So one of the things that we developed as a steering committee is a multi-year plan. So in response from the WRDSB, we've implemented this multi-year plan, and this multi-year plan is in place. I think we're moving into the second year. I believe we're moving into the second year, which is really focusing on word recognition. That does not mean that we forget about the other components that are really key and important, but this is where we do a deep dive. And then we move into language comprehension and then skilled reading in years to come. So this is what we have developed as a board, and the trajectory that we look at as we are implementing structured literacy across the board.
Bobbie, do you have a more formalized scope and sequence as well, or is this does this sort of act as the scope and sequence for your board?
Well, this is basically the direction or the focus, area of focus, and where we take a deep dive and where we provide PD and supports for our educators across the system. When we're thinking about a scope and sequence, and that's in particular, you know, what we're looking at within grade classrooms, we haven't landed on anything specific. We're just waiting for more information from the ministry around, you know, what does that that curriculum look like. But as we talk a little bit more about the resources that we're using, we can add a little bit more detail about the scope and sequences that we focus on within our schools.
Great. There's so many boards doing excellent work around this area. I think like really identifying specific skills and making a scope and sequence, making it so much easier. I think for the classroom teacher to get the work done. So we wanted to talk a little bit about PD, and I know I guess we could have set it up with with some of the last questions that we had. I don't know if I was shocked or surprised in the report. It really talks a little bit about hampering job embedded professional learning because of the shift in the way that the province has been handling professional learning. And that's no surprise to anyone who's been around education for any length of time, because you see so many different changes in the way the ministry has handled PD and the way the boards have handled PD, whether we're releasing educators and bringing them all down to a central location, or we're sending teams out to schools, or the train the trainer model that went on. And it's not saying anything is good or bad. We know that things change based on what best practices and what we know at the time. But how have you been working to find a shift in PD that really works for your board? And I'm going to have Bobbie take it first here.
Yeah, we're just going to talk about two structures. So next slide, please. Two structures we've embedded within our board. One is what we call reading resource teachers. So we have 38 reading resource teachers within our schools. And basically the teachers, it's a 0.5 of an FTE. And the teachers are providing Empower for grade 2 students within that one school that they're working at. And the rest of the time they're providing tier 1 support, so classroom teacher support in terms of embedding structured literacy, working with teachers, showing them what it could look like within their classrooms, providing some model support, and having really good discussions about what structured literacy looks like within their grades. And then we have a wraparound support, and this is 26 schools. And these are ministry identified schools who have received some targeted supports. And these wraparound schools go through a 6-week cycle of inquiry-based learning around literacy. We also had it with mathematics as well, but the literacy was a component of it, and structured literacy was one area that we really focused on. And we looked at resources such as Haggerty for phonemic awareness and UFly for phonics support for those schools, and really helped teachers embed those within their classrooms, show them how to use the resources, and support their students with those essential skills.
Bobbie, before we move to the next slide, I wondered if you could clarify the reading resource teachers. You're saying they're half-time in a school, and their assignment is teaching Empower. Did I hear that correctly?
Yes.
Do you have any strategies in place to retain teachers who are are they committed to teaching Empower? I know you can't force them to do it, but is there something that you're using to try to retain them for the long run?
Well, one of the things that we are trying to do, and one of our goals, and I think that we're almost going to be there next year, is that every school will have Empower. And so we have 107 elementary schools. So every school will have Empower. We also want to embed it in some of our high schools as well. And so then we know that support will be in every school. What it specifically looks like, or what it's looked like in the past, is more of our junior students have received it. But what we're finding with the research is the earlier the intervention that's put into place, the better. Great.
And you had some system initiatives to talk about.
Yeah, so there are other things that we have done as well, and we have Google Groups, we have D2L courses that we've implemented, as well as book clubs. We just finished a 6-part literacy learning series, and these are after-school sessions where people can join. We had a huge uptake, come and learn in those 6-part series. But we also have websites, and we have our consultants on board who are connected to each one of our elementary schools, 107 of them. And then we have consultants that are connected to our high schools too, the 16 of them.
So, and these consultants sleep at the education center, or do they get to go home? That's quite a list.
They are
Karyn.
superstars.
Sounds like it. Karyn.
All right, we have a few different models as well, but I think one of the new ones to us, especially with the difficulty that we've had with release of teachers and getting supply teachers in, is that we have a workshop model where we bring a workshop to the school with some of our central team members that run that. And then that releases a few of the teachers to do PD in 80-minute chunks throughout the day. So then there would be other consultants that are working with them while we're doing that. We have coaches that support teachers individually. We also have a piggyback model that we're running right now where two of our consultants, our French and our English consultant, go out together. And if it's a teacher who is from the French immersion side, then the French one stays with them and the other one goes into the classroom, covers the classroom while they do PD, and vice versa, because we have dual track schools. But one of the things I think that's been a big change for us is that we have really looked for resources now that include PD with them, because we know that PD is sometimes hard to get. And so, for example, when we purchased the UFly resource, part of the thinking behind that was the PD that was actually built into the program. And then I think, like other school boards, we run after school, we call it Sunset PD on associated topics. And we run what we call concepts to classrooms, where the consultant goes out and works with a teacher on something that's a prepackaged topic that we actually want to be delivering on. And then the teacher asks for support and the consultant goes out. So for us, that's kind of like our early adopter focused learning, so that we can get some of those early adopters moving, and then holding the hands of people who like an early adopter to go first.
Such an excellent idea. I've heard a number of boards, again, across Ontario using that model of kind of the ask and receive, right? So early adopters who are saying, I could really use some support with this, and making them a priority. Thanks, Karyn. I'm just gonna get back to Bobbie here. And Bobbie, once again, I want to focus a little more on the senior team now, and the focus of this webinar really was, we were hoping to really target superintendents and system principals, system teams, coordinators who are working at that level of implementing change system wide. And again, recommendations 131 to 137 there, it talks about the need for standards and consistency and monitoring and accountability. And I think those are all really system priorities, and Provincial as well. But could you talk a little bit about that, Bobbie? Like how is the senior team able to support these changes?
Yeah, so we think the senior team, that component is a vital component, and that's why within our structured literacy steering committee, we have members of the senior team, including our associate director, who's been a champion of this reading work from the beginning. I also want to indicate too, within our board improvement and equity plan, one of our specific indicators is about reading, and the percentage of students by the end of grade 2 who will be reading. That's our target. We really want all of our students by the end of grade 2 reading. And we also this message has been reiterated over and over again by our senior team, including our director. And it is embedded within our strategic directions, within our conditions for learning within our schools, which are part of our foundational documents within the WRDSB. But what's really key and important is that consistent communication that happens from the senior team all the way down to the central team, and then at the school level as well. And we take that field intelligence from the school level and bring it back up to that steering committee, so that we can really make appropriate decisions and next steps to support our students at our schools.
Thank you. Karyn, can you tell us a little bit about your senior team?
Sure. We're a much smaller board, just to kind of start off with. So there's really only one of us for each thing. So one of the things that we've implemented this year is, and I think a little bit before, but the coordinated services model. So we actually run meetings together with business, curriculum, special education, and our multidisciplinary leads to be able to review some of these different decisions that we're making, and making sure that we get that cross-disciplinary support to happen as we take on some of these different projects. And that way we know that everything's being designed with the perspectives of all the experts that we have. And I think the big part too is that what we're doing is supported by business services, so that they really understand what it is that we're trying to do and can help us with some of the budget items and different ways that we can maybe be creative that way. I think the other thing too is that we've spent a lot of time with our principals, really building the big picture and digging in on the screening data that we have, because we ran screening this year from K to 8 so that we'd get a sense of where kids were at, especially post-COVID. And our principals are invited to attend our special education resource teacher meetings where we do next steps. So for example, we've done the screener K to 8, but in special education for our tier 2 and 3, we've been running progress monitoring. So our principals come to those kinds of meetings where they can get training on that and kind of see all of those different things, because that'll be something that we roll out later on for all of the teachers. I think a big focus, and I think I heard Bobbie say something about it before, like we really need to understand that this is about instructional equity and that this is about really shifting our focus from designing for the typical student to really designing what we're doing as a first point for the kids that need the instruction most, and what that means for equity and removing barriers for kids. And then we pool our budget based on our priorities. So the superintendents will sit together and make sure that whatever it is that we feel like we need as our next step, we're using whatever budget sources we have between us to be able to get there.
I think that's so key, the statement around equity, Karyn. And I think that's really, what would bring together, all the different departments or all the different pieces at the central office. That it's not just a question of spec ed or student services, right? This isn't about students with learning disabilities or dyslexia. This is about all students. And so that's where I think, we've got curriculum and student services, but also where facility services and everything has a place at the table here to talk about it, because it really is about equity.
I think one of the things, Martin, if I can just add, is that a lot of times people see tier 1 as curriculum, and then tier 2 is maybe a blend between curriculum and special education, and then tier 3 no one's really sure about. But the problem is that when you're actually putting together a response to instruction model, your tier 1 has to be completely coherent with your tier 3. So all of those decisions need to be made collectively together so that what you're doing as an initial point in the classroom is actually meeting the needs of all of the kids, and hopefully preventing the need for kids to go into tier 3, because that's a much more intensive piece.
Great. Thank you, Karyn. So this has been a burning question, I think, across the province, and it comes up in so many of the meetings I have with boards and with my contacts, and it's really it's about resources, right? So how do you select the programs that you're using? And I shared an article, I think, with Bobbie and Karyn that talked a little bit about this. It came from, was it North Carolina, maybe? I can't remember, but they were talking about sort of a warning to say that there are so many resources out there that publishers have just rebranded and, put the name on, all natural ingredients, right? It's all like it's science of reading, or it's evidence-based instruction. And really what it is, it's just kind of a reworking of what we've seen before around balanced literacy or the 3 queuing system. So I think the need is to be so very, very careful when you're selecting programs that you're making the right choices. So Karyn, do you want to talk to us a little bit about how your board has made some of its decisions?
Sure. I think what you're talking about is exactly part of what we've really tried to be looking at, is getting a sense that evidence-based is not the same thing as research-based or evidence-informed, and it's not the same thing as promising practices or best practices or high-impact practices. And we're seeing the same thing. Publishers dropping stuff that says that it's research-based or evidence-based, and when you look at it, it actually isn't. So you've got to be really careful. And as a school board, I think you really need to know your stuff to determine what is evidence-based and what isn't. I think the other part that one of the things that helps us a lot with that is there's the IES What Works Clearinghouse. So we refer to that a lot. They actually have a tool that helps you to review a resource and determine what the evidence base is for it and whether or not it's targeting what it is that you're trying to target. So that's a great tool. We've done a lot of work on the science of learning in conjunction with the science of reading to understand, so what are some of those different pieces that you should see happening within a resource, and making sure that you're seeing things like interleaved practice and spaced practice and elaboration and all of those key kind of pieces of the science of learning kind of embedded into whatever the resource is. Like I said, we also have been looking for things that actually have professional development that are embedded right into them, where there's a lot of explanation about the why, so that teachers can be more structured in how it is that they're delivering things. And then ultimately, we want to make sure that everything is culturally relevant. So we're always looking for that culturally relevant piece. I feel like that's coming along. It's been quite difficult. One of the other struggles that we currently have too is that there seems to be a lot of this in the States, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of Canadian materials that offer what it is that we're looking for, which makes it difficult, but hopefully that's going to be something that comes along.
Great, thank you, Karyn. Bobbie, do you have anything to add in terms of your selection of resources?
If you go to the next slide, you can see some of the resources that we've tried within our schools. And I want to say that we've tried, because we haven't really landed on anything in particular, except for the U Fly Foundations, a resource that we know is based on many years of research. And we've also received a lot of great feedback around this resource. But I think we're going to talk a little bit about, data and, is it working? Is it not working a little bit later on? But those are some of the resources that we have either provided or teachers have picked up on their own, or schools have provided for their staff as well.
Would you agree, Bobbie and Karyn, that the needs got to come first? And I think that's been part of the issue around resources, is that sometimes people are very quick to try to find the resource, but they're not really able to clearly identify what the need is. So the resource doesn't necessarily meet the need. Does that ring true at all?
Yeah, one of the things I think that is really key and important is the understanding, right? The understanding the science behind it. Because some people might think that they're just going to take this resource and implement it and that's it. But it really is very important for our educators to understand how reading works within the brain, and that this is not a natural process, and that it can be very difficult, and that as a teacher, you do need to be very knowledgeable and understand what that specific next step is for the students, so that they can be successful.
Thank you very much. This is the question I've been waiting for, because I know, Karyn, you already mentioned Reading Recovery, I think, had been a resource in your board, and not an inexpensive program at all. We know lots of boards have invested a lot of money in leveled readers and LLI, PMDRA, all of these tools and resources that in the report, are suddenly becoming, I guess, irrelevant in teaching. And not that they're bad tools, but I know Una Malcolm, who was one of our workshop leaders last year at the Educators Institute, talked about a lot of these tools, saying that they have specific they have specific purposes. But the problem is that the purpose of a lot of our grade-based assessments and leveled resources don't meet the skills and the needs of the evidence-based program for students. So there's a real disconnect there. So schools are left with a lot of resources that we have to make some decisions about, because I don't think people are going to be quite prepared to just, dump them in the bin right now. So Karyn, can you talk a little bit about what you're doing in your board with some of these resources?
For sure. And it kind of goes back to that whole scope and sequence that we had initially been talking about getting to reading comprehension, because we know that the 3 queuing system ultimately was very focused on the reading comprehension part. And not to say that we're not focused on that, we're just doing really systematic and explicit skill building to be able to get there in the approach that we're taking now. So one of the things that we're doing is we're putting together a resource to support the reorganization of some of our leveled texts into read alouds, because we know, if you think about that Scarborough rope, that we still have to work on that knowledge or that language comprehension part to be able to get to comprehension later. So we want to continue to use things as read alouds, but we're placing a read aloud sticker over the level. And then we would be suggesting that people move things into the language comprehension part of our literacy block to be read aloud by the teacher, where you can actually be talking about genres and language structures and things that are in that. So we have a few different organizational groups for the books. One group is for read aloud text to explore those things like genres and structures. Another grouping is on read aloud texts that are related to our content area topics, so that we can be looking at literacy through content area topics in that language comprehension part of the block. And then a third grouping is on books that support learning about concepts of print, prosody, things like that, so that teachers have access to text for that purpose. One of the things that we did get asked by the schools was to collect the 3Qing based assessment tools so that they aren't there because they felt they were taking up space. So that we have done that, and we're looking at beefing up kind of like the decodables that we have, but not necessarily getting rid of the books that we already do have. And then some of the other tools that you were talking about as part of things like where you're actually using the tokens and figuring out the sounds and words and all of that, we're still using that. So we really need to know what it is that we need to be teaching. And there are pieces of some of those that you're going to be able to continue to use in instruction because they were solid instruction. And then there are other parts of it, like the text, that actually cause students to have to use 3Qing systems to be able to figure out what it says that we don't want to have kids doing because it builds bad habits.
Thank you, Karyn. Bobbie?
Yeah, and just to add, if you want to go to the next slide, just want to talk a little bit about home reading. So we have a number of schools where our school council members have purchased a number of level texts over the years. And so what we're really encouraging people to do is to reorganize those texts according to interest and theme, and then students can take home any books that they want to. And it's really important that parents know that reading to their children is still very key. Even if their child can read, it's still really important. And then just, listening to stories really builds knowledge, and knowledge is a key factor in successful listening and reading comprehension. And so it's really important for our families to know that we're making that shift and that they need to be making that shift. So instead of sending home, for example, some bookmarks that we used to send in the past about different reading strategies, we're really encouraging families to read for enjoyment and to really engage and stimulate their child's imagination when it comes to reading a book together.
Thank you. This is a question that I thought was really interesting. The report really talks a lot about interventions and accommodations, and I think it really hit the nail on the head. And I think it's so important when board teams are looking for direction or trying to make decisions that you head into this report and look at some of these recommendations, because I think they're really kind of the lighthouse, right, that can really guide you out. And the report is very clear around the types of reading interventions that should or should not be used in schools. So we've already talked a little bit about how tier systems are used in your board. Is there anything else you'd like to add around tiered interventions that may have changed for students who struggle in your board? And I'm going to let Bobbie start us off.
Well, one of the areas that we really have been focusing on, and we will continue to focus on, is the tier 1 intervention and what that looks like, that classroom level support, and how we can really support our students in becoming successful readers at the classroom level. And so we will continue down that road and support teachers with what that looks like within their classrooms.
Thank you. Karyn?
Yeah, I think for us, tier 1 is an important part. So we've been doing some work for teachers to really understand that there's a difference between small group instruction and small group intervention. And that for some students, we need to be doing small group intervention as part of that tier 1 support that they are doing based on things that they haven't mastered previously that they need to be mastering. But another big piece that I think we're starting to work on now, and that we'll see even more of next year, is really understanding how we increase intensity within the tier, and then how we increase intensity across the tiers, and making decisions about whether a student is going to go from tier 1 to tier 2, or whether they're going to go from tier 1 to tier 3, because that's the pacing that they're going to be needing, or the level of repetition that they're going to require in order to be successful. So we've been doing some work around quantitative and qualitative ways of increasing intensity within the tier. And then, for example, at tier 3, if they're doing an empower and you really don't have too much flexibility to be changing things, to then be able to layer in things at the tier 1 that they're also experiencing at the same time as they're, well, at a different time, but consecutively with their empower, so that we can increase the intensity within the classroom to increase the intensity overall. So just really kind of starting to dig in on what it looks like to do tiered intervention that is coherent.
Yeah, I think it's, in my mind, sometimes it's tricky that we call them tier 1, 2, and 3, because really it's just instruction, right? It's all the same instruction. It's the intensity and the time that changes. And I think that's kind of a shift for our thinking in Ontario a little bit, is to say it is the same instruction, doesn't matter where you are, you're learning the same skills. So it'll be interesting to see how that rolls out over the next little while. Well, we're getting down to it, and here's the big question: is it working? So the report says with science-based approaches, we should really start to see something like maybe only 5% of students still below grade level expectations. And I know it's very early to be asking you to share, any data or great revelations, but I know that both of you have some great success stories to talk about. So I think, yeah, Karyn, why don't you lead us off on this one?
Okay, so like I said earlier, we rolled out a screener from K to 8. So there was a question in the chat that I saw about which screener was it. We went with Dibbles, the 8th edition of Dibbles. So that was what we did for K to 8. We also trained the certs to be doing the progress monitoring using the tool for our tier 2 and tier 3 interventions. And I just want to be clear for people who haven't moved into using screeners. Screeners are not diagnostic assessments. They just tell you who is at risk. And then from there, we need to dig in on diagnostic tools like the PAST, the core phonics survey is another one that we use, for example, to find out where the particular struggles are so that we can determine what the next steps are going to be with regards to instruction and intervention and at what tier. So we actually had a couple of places where it showed that the whole classroom was at significant risk. So kind of a sea of red using that particular tool. So we've implemented a whole classroom-wide tier 2 intervention that is in the classroom. So it's like it's tier 1. It's just the dosage and the intensity of it is higher than what you would generally see at tier 1. So we're trying out Wilson's Just Words for that particular one.
Okay, Bobbie?
And just to add, we actually implemented a pilot just recently for an early screener within our reading resource teacher schools, or the schools where we have reading resource teachers. And we don't have a lot of data. It was really just to see how we implement the actual screener in order to be able to implement it on a larger scale in the fall when we get more information from the ministry. We have received lots of anecdotal information about using resources such as the Haggerty resource or the UFly resource, which we've supported schools with. And this is just an example of one of the teachers who have used the resource, have been provided the PD through our consultant support, and is very positive, along with a number of our teachers who have been given that capacity building session with the PD.
Thank you. Down to our last two questions, and Karyn, why don't you kick this one off? What are your next steps in the board? And it's interesting that oh, wait a minute here. Next steps. This talks about equity again. It sort of brings us back to what you were talking about a little earlier. So what are the next steps for your board?
So we're anticipating celebrating the progress that our students have made, but we also recognize that, there's going to be an implementation dip. Right now, all of our teachers are learning how to do this stuff. So we're not anticipating that we're going to see huge progress right away. We're in the process of collecting some of that. However, I will say that we had a number of kids, even at midpoint in the year, that had gone from red, which is significantly at risk, into green, which is like not really at risk. So if you're using Dibbles, there's blue, there's green, there's yellow, and there's red. Blue being you don't have to worry about them at all, and red is get them into intervention as soon as you possibly can. So we need to do some work with our educators to really understand the screening data that we have, because we've been making some good growth with that. But one of the difficulties that we're having is that when people take a look at percentile data, they'll see a percentile at the beginning of the year, they'll see a percentile at the end of the year, and maybe it hasn't changed that much. But when you actually take a look at what the assessment has been asking the students to do, it's night and day different. And so we're just doing a lot of work, I think, as far as next steps to really understand what that data is telling you. And then from that, that tier one kind of instructional equity piece, I think we're just really going to continue to be working on that. So we're planning on making a decision-making tool to help teams that will to know whether or not it's time to move into a different tier. We're helping out teams because we're also doing math intervention to determine whether they're going to do sequential intervention, whether they're going to do concurrent. So sequential, obviously one before the other, concurrent is both at the same time, or whether they're going to do a blended intervention where maybe they're going to go big on one of them and then just do a little bit of intervention on one of the other ones, because that's been an area of need for us. And then the other part that we've really been working on is we've been removing the requirement to have an IEP for accommodations, for those accommodations that we've identified as universal, because we know that we can't have accommodations that require an IEP if we want to be equitable for students, because we don't know who all the kids are that need them. So if the accommodations are pointing out a barrier to us, then we really need to rethink and remove the barrier instead of trying to figure out how to accommodate it. So that's one of the big things that we're doing. We've also designed a full year 2-credit de-streamed English course that offers tiered intervention opportunities in secondary. So for the first half of the period, they do a tier 2 intervention. Second half of the period, it's de-streamed English. And so we're hoping that that will help them to be more successful. And we're moving intervention as well, intervention programs, I guess, into our locally developed grade 9 English and math, because we know those kids also need the exact same repetition, or the exact same structures. They just need more repetition, some chunking, some visual supports, and they need to move at a pace that optimizes their progress in reading and math. So those are some of the different pieces that we're trying out for next year.
Thank you. We did a webinar a few weeks ago that talked about the IEP and explored, you know, some of the, I guess, some of the limitations of the current IEP with the new evidence-based reading system. And, you know, one of the speculations was, if we're actually teaching an evidence-based reading, early literacy reading program, maybe most of those kids wouldn't even need the reading component of the IEP, because if they have, you know, they have a good systematic scope and sequence, and they're working within the tiered system, doesn't that cover off most of the educational goals just for the reading component? So really something to think of, or actually more to say, you know, we really need some changes around the IEP and what it's going to look like. Bobbie, what are your next steps?
We're doing a number of things. One of the pieces that we're working on right now is the literacy planning framework. So just going into more detail around that is thinking about, like, what does phonics and decoding look like within our classroom? Language comprehension, writing, phonemic awareness, and small group instruction within our classrooms. We're looking at that within our K classroom, within our primary classroom, juniors and intermediate, and so on and so forth. The other piece that we are really trying to dive into, and we're waiting a little bit for the literacy curriculum, as well as those milestones to support in the different areas. So what does it look like in kindergarten when we're thinking about phonological awareness and phonics? What are some of those key skills that we want to make sure that our students have in those different grade levels? And a third thing we are really ensuring that we dive into is looking at that 7 to grade 10 support. What does structured literacy look like within those classrooms? Who is responsible for that? So, I mean, that's a whole other webcast to be talking about, but there's a lot of talk, and people are really craving that information and really want to know how they can support their students from grade 7 all the way to grade 10 in terms of reading. And then the last but not least, one of the things that we are really working on is that community connection. So the importance of including families, and that this information across the families, especially our families that we traditionally may not be able to reach. We want to ensure that we reach those families to make sure that they are knowledgeable about what's important to know about reading, but B, also where they can provide some support with their children and what we would be doing at schools. So we have lots to be doing.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bobbie. And while you're still catching your breath here, we're just going to move to our final question. So your best advice, and we're gonna ask you to just to give one piece of advice each to school boards on the journey. Bobbie?
Sure, I'll start. Well, for me, I think it takes a village. We want to ensure that with this work, that everyone from our senior team members to our central team members to our administrators in schools to our teachers and families, as I had just mentioned, are all involved in this, and that there are those lenses that we may have forgotten about or may want to make sure that we ensure that we have that lens at the forefront so that we are meeting that need and that support of 95% of our students will absolutely read. And I'm really confident that when we do it together as a team like that, that we will get there.
Terrific. Karyn, one piece of advice.
I think that we really need to understand that this is a paradigm shift. What we're doing in classrooms right now is not tier 1, but it needs to be. Tier 1, I think, is part of like a tier 1, 2, and 3 instructional coherence system. And we really need to understand those pieces so that we can design effectively and really understand that that paradigm shift that we're doing is to intervene before there are errors or before there are failures or difficulties with students, and to really turn the classroom design paradigm over on its head, because we're designing now first for the students who struggle most and differentiating from there. And I think it's really critical that that part is understood, because the focus is on instructional equity, which means the opportunities of those who are equity deserving are favored first in the design. And that's really what we're doing with all of this.
Terrific. And that kind of brings us to the close. So thank you very much, Bobbie and Karyn. Boy, I've heard it before, and the webinar, and I enjoyed it for the second time. So thank you very much. There's been so much information in this, and we will be sharing the PowerPoint. And I do have Bobbie and Karyn's emails there, so I'm sure that they'd be happy to answer any further questions. This is a slide that we've put a little bit of the information on there. I think I might have confused people. We put the Equipped for Reading Success, and there was already a question around that. Around the course. Did anyone actually do the Kilpatrick course, or were you just using the resources? Bobbie or Karyn, have you?
So I know some of our people did the course, but not like everybody. I think
Not
it would be
board-wide. Yeah, okay.
Level we would have done some of that.
Yeah, I've heard that as well, that there's certain boards have offered it to specific teachers or groups of teachers. So we got a couple of questions, and I'm going to see if I can pull them out. Sadly, I don't have any information on the new curriculum coming out. That's one of the questions that we had. Lots of great questions here. So, but the one, where did I? Here it is. Here's one that I think we're hearing a lot about. So how do you think you will analyze and determine whether more students are reading at a grade level if the types of assessments and screening tools, well, the types of assessments are different than they were? So example, DRA versus the DIBELS. Karyn, do you want to take that?
Sure. And I guess maybe I'm going to start off with the benchmarks that we had never told us whether they were reading at a grade level, because they weren't connected to the curriculum. And what we have now is also not connected to the curriculum, but what it is very connected to is the skill base that students actually need to have developed to be able to move forward. So what it tells you is where they are on the continuum, and whether based on their age, they are on the continuum pathway that they should be, which I think is far better than the information that we would have received prior with things like the PM benchmarks or DRA, because that was telling us information about their use of strategies that we don't want them to be using.
And if I can add, one of the pieces with the early screeners, from my understanding, is that we can see where the gaps are, where the areas are that students really need that support. And that's where we can dive in as educators to be providing those explicit skills for those students and teaching them.
Bobbie, can you tell us a little bit about the specific screeners you've been using and at what grade levels?
So as I said before, we're just piloting one of the screeners, and it was in our K-2 schools where we have our reading resource teachers, and that's the Acadians, and it's the online Acadians version that we have piloted in our school.
Thank you, Karyn. Screeners that you've been using, and are you using them like K-8 or just early years?
So we did initially, like that's not going to be a forever thing. We really wanted to get a sense from the board about where we were at with it. So yes, we have just been using the Dibbles 8th edition as our screener across everyone.
Okay. Here's a question. How have you been supporting teaching literacy for students who might have more complex communication needs? So example, nonverbal or developmental issues. They may not be good candidates for the intensity of interventions like Empower. So how are you handling those types of students?
That's a really good question. And one of the things that we're working on is some sort of document to support classroom teachers with our SLPs, our speech and language pathologists. And so we are continuing that work, I'm hoping over the summer, so that we will have something ready to go for the fall for classroom teachers, because you're right, it is really important that we reach those students as well.
Great, thank you. I think I'm going to turn it over to Susanna. I bet she's sitting in the wings, anxious to get control of us again.
Oh, I'm just the one that keeps the eye on the time so that we can get all of our educators back to where they need to be with their families, with their friends. But I do want to say a giant thank you to Martin Smith for being our moderator, Bobbie Chatha and Karyn Bruneel for lending us their big brains today and helping us tackle this big daunting change in the way we teach reading in Ontario. And I also want to applaud our audience for attending and for being so interested in this topic and being on the cutting edge of this change as well. So that being said, I will just quickly wrap everything up.
Susanna, can I just sort of make a quick add as well?
Yeah.
We did on the resource page have LD at School, and we do have a specific resource area called Right to Read resources. So, you know, a lot of information is on there. And there's so many great questions still in the chat board. I know Susanna's going to capture them, and I want to let you know that we often use those questions to help us determine direction for new resources. Or, you know, if you're in a school board and you're doing something really, really exciting around evidence-based instruction, particularly with older students, please reach out to us, because we're always looking to highlight those types of projects. Thanks, Susanna.
Thanks for always advertising us too. So yeah, as Martin said, right at the top of the screen, when you hit our homepage, LD at School, there's a big button that says Right to Read resources, and that's where we've categorized everything that has to do with this change in literacy instruction. Martin also mentioned I will be collecting these questions and they will help guide us in the future. But if you do have additional questions, you can always email us or reach out on Twitter. That information's on the screen right now. And that's all the time we have for today. So we're going to end the webinar at this time. And on behalf of the LD at School team, I'd like to thank everyone once again. Please remember, we'll be sending out a presentation slides and a short survey following today's webinar, probably tomorrow morning-ish. The feedback we received through the surveys is actually really important for our planning, so we highly recommend that you do it. And we will also connect with you once the webinar recording is available. So thank you again, and go enjoy the rest of your day.